Before we start, I need to set some ground rules. If you see me, suddenly stop talking and stare at a corner of the ceiling. Do not turn around to look. Do not follow my gaze. Just let me have my panic attack in peace. I saw a shadow move backstage, and my brain has already started drafting my will. Everything goes to my cat. Uh, Except I don't have one. Maybe my dog, but I don't have one of those either. Then maybe my houseplant, but that died under my care, so clearly I'm not fit to make any of these legal decisions. At this point, I'll sort out my imaginary inheritance when I'm gracefully suspended somewhere between my very human self and the lovely angel that I've always been. As ridiculous as that sounds, fear has always had a talent for arriving before I do. Humor has always been my favorite way to introduce my fears because it is easier to laugh at them than to admit how much space they once occupied. The funny thing is, none of those fears are actually about the shadows. They're about the stories we tell ourselves when we're afraid. And for a long time, I believed every single one of mine. 3 years ago, I would have looked at a crowd this size and felt my ribs cave in. I would have found the nearest exit before you even found your seat. I would have convinced myself this stage was a trap, the microphone was a lie, and every single one of you sitting here was secretly judging my pulse. So yes, I laugh with you now, I stand tall, I even enjoy it, but trust me, I am still that person who would have run just towards the mic now. For a long time, social anxiety was not my enemy, it was my invisible architect. It worked in the quiet, meticulous hours of my childhood, shrinking my world brick by brick, corner by corner, until the horizons of my life felt small enough to touch. I wasn't living in a house, a room filled with Barbies and glitters. I was living in a blueprint designed by my own terror. The others around me often asked, "Your twin sister is always on stages making it her own. Why don't you?" I stayed silent. Not because I didn't have an answer, but because how could I explain to them that the fear of merely speaking up held me in a chokehold? The girl who had once laughed at the silliest jokes and carried sunshine in her smile had somewhere faded deep into memory. In her place stood someone who was quieter, heavier, and far too familiar with silence. But here's the thing. The architecture of my fear didn't begin with a crowd. It began in a dark room with a flickering screen and a decision that we were never supposed to make. See, that summer was supposed to be the summer. The one with sticky ice cream fights, mango pits across the yard, and laughter so loud that the neighbors complained. But somewhere in the middle of all that heat and haze, it turned into something else. Something more quieter, something more heavier. Lean in for this one. This is where I need your full attention. Our parents had strictly forbidden horror movies. But rebellion has a way of whispering louder than rules. So one evening, when they were out shopping, my cousins and I hid, pressed play, and watched The Conjuring, completely unaware of the fear we were about to invite into our lives. For the rest of them, the credits rolled, the lights came up, and the unsettling feeling evaporated with the smell of popcorn. But for me, those credits were only the beginning. That movie didn't just scare me, it rewrote me. It fractured my sense of security for 3 years straight. I was constantly afraid of the dark, afraid to be alone, clinging to my parents as if distance itself was dangerous. My thoughts were loudest in the dark, echoing when everything else was still and when everyone got tired of listening to the same excuses after waking up at midnight. I learned something rather quickly. Fear makes people uncomfortable. So I stopped talking about it. And unknowingly, I had shut myself off from all the conversations happening around me. Because I was the quiet one, people assumed I was okay. They thought silence meant peace, but it didn't, it meant paralysis. The others who knew me saw a girl who was afraid of the dark, afraid to be alone, but they didn't ask why. Instead, they labeled weak, sensitive, too much. Imagine you are in a room full of mirrors. Some mirrors show you a reflection of who you are, but some mirrors are cracked, dirty, and bent, and they show you a reflection that isn't even yours. That is exactly how people work. Their insecurities, their judgments, their opinions bend your own reflection until you doubt yourself, until you start to believe that maybe the problem is me. In my case, every single mirror felt distorted. Not because I was forced into perfection, but because I was trusted with it. The silent weight of expectations. To excel in academics, to succeed in starting conversations with strangers that I barely knew, and most importantly, not to be afraid, weighed down on me. But that weight didn't make me stronger, it made me quieter. So I learned to hide the very fears I was never supposed to have. I became trapped in an exhausting loop, constantly wondering how others perceived me, constantly trying to predict outcomes. My fear for the horror and unsettling movies had manifested into a desperate need to predict the unknown. If I couldn't predict the outcome of a conversation, I wouldn't have it. If I couldn't guarantee acceptance, I simply withdrew. Are you made of glass? So fragile. You flinch at your own shadow. Look at you, trembling, barely holding yourself together. What is it that you need? A teddy bear and a blanket to feel safe? Or are you too afraid to even speak? The whispers crept in, first theirs, then mine, coiling tighter, growing louder until it all fused into something suffocating. A relentless noise I couldn't escape, couldn't outrun, couldn't silence. My thoughts were fractured, slipping through my grasp as I drowned beneath them. At first they were external, then they became mine. Why are you so scared? Why can't you just be normal? And somewhere in the middle of all that chaos, I surfaced. But the quiet that returned wasn't gentle, it wasn't peace, it was something darker, something waiting, a low, feral roar rising from within. Enough. And then something shifted. Not dramatically, not all at once, but enough. I realized something simple. A boat doesn't sink because of the water around it, it sinks because of the water that gets inside. I had spent years letting the opinions of others, their expectations, their judgments leak into my hull while leaving no space for my own voice. My turn the turn isn't a single life-changing moment. It was a quiet accumulation. Years of swallowed thoughts, shrinking silences, invisible battles, all gathering weight beneath the surface until one day, without warning, they all rose within me, all at once. It was a quiet decision made on a Tuesday night while crying myself to sleep to choose myself. And I want to be clear. There is nothing wrong with being silent, but I wasn't choosing it, I was hiding inside it. I wore quietness like an armor, a carefully constructed version of myself so others would feel comfortable even if I didn't. Inside, my mind was loud, restless, relentless, but outside I stayed still because speaking felt riskier than suffocating. I began with small acts of defiance. I started speaking before the cold hands of doubt could silence me. I let my voice tremble but refused to let it retreat. I began frequenting coffee shops and bookstores alone, leaning into the discomfort until the air felt breathable again. I started staying present in moments I would have once avoided, and when I finally chose to correct people on what they said about me, they told me, "You've changed." And they were right, I had. Today, as I stand here, I am not here to prove that I've become louder, but I'm here to show that quietness and gentleness are not weakness, but they are depth. They often hold strength, resilience, and reflection in ways noise often cannot. But I also stand here as a reminder that you cannot survive by wearing a personality that isn't yours. A borrowed facade might shield you from the rumors, might even end conversations faster, but it slowly erases you in the process. I had to be the girl who drew her lines and held them firm, who refused to let anyone walk through her like she was made of doors instead of walls. I had to become that girl, not to prove anything to anyone else, but for the little girl still living inside my chest. The one who had whispered her fears into empty rooms, believing her voice would never reach another ear. So I built those boundaries for her so she could finally stop waiting to be heard. So I built those boundaries around her like a fortress, and this time not a single voice gets past it until she opens the door herself. So yes, I'm still scared of the dark. I still sleep with the lights on sometimes. I still flinch at creaky doors, but I'm done hiding. डर से रिश्ता आज भी है, पर फैसला बदल गया है. पहले डर मुझे रोकता था, अब रास्ता बदल गया है. उड़ना फरिश्तों का हुनर होगा. उड़ना फरिश्तों का हुनर होगा. मैंने तो इंसान होकर ही आसमान छूना सीख लिया है. मैंने तो इंसान होकर ही आसमान छूना सीख लिया है. I am Adwitya Choudhary, still learning, still growing, but finally willing to move, and so can you. Thank you.